Hey patrons, how's it going? I've got my kombucha today instead of coffee, just for a little change of pace. Okay, so a couple years back, I made a detailed what are my settings in my camera video for the EOS R. I'll link to that in the description of this video on the Patreon post, but I wanted to make a new version of that for the new R6, because I think a lot of you probably purchased the R6 recently. And I'll also say that virtually every setting would be the exact same for the R5. Except I would probably tweak the power saving modes to be a little bit more aggressive so that the R5, I know they've issued a few fixes and stuff for the overheating problems, but in general, it's probably not going to perform at its max spec for quite as long as the R6 if you're using the fastest CF Express cards and really pushing the R5 to its very limits. It's probably going to overheat. But that's really the only difference that I would make between setting up the R6 or the R5. Honestly, it's very similar to how I set up the EOS R. So just pause your way through this video, and hopefully you get a lot out of it. Probably the most interesting aspect is going to be the second half of this video, where I dive more into how I have my buttons customized and everything. But here we go. I have my screen output recording to this little HDMI recorder. And just to give you a quick sense of the experience of how I shoot, I rarely, almost never, do I manually adjust the focus point. I always start with the center upper kind of third area using a singular focus point, exactly like you see here. That's just generally because I'm photographing people, and I normally want to trend where their eyes and their face land in the composition, at least as a starting point. I want them to land in the upper third area of the shot, not in the exact center. And really the only reason you would want to trend toward the exact true center is if you're using a DSLR or maybe older lenses, older glass, where it's more likely to hit focus in the center because that's where it's truly the sharpest. But these days with mirrorless cameras, I don't think that that's necessarily as important anymore. I think you're fine to have your starting point really anywhere. So I always start in the upper third, and then I kind of hover over what I want my subject, whatever I want to be sharp and in focus. I half press my shutter button, and that engages the autofocus motor, and then I recompose and then take the final shot from there. So you can see it 3D tracks beautifully. I don't have a face to track. Well, I guess I could try that. But yeah, it definitely has very high resolution eye tracking as well. And yeah, Canon has certainly caught up in that regard. It is basically real-time seamless tracking, unless you're photographing something very, very tricky. So that is the vast majority of how I experience photography and how I set myself up and shoot. Almost never do I manually thumb the focus point around to go anywhere else like you're seeing here. I just simply keep it there. Whatever I end up recomposing to, as soon as I let go of the shutter or as soon as I take the picture and let go, it bumps right back to the previous center upper third. That's almost always my starting point. Now, I'll say that is the case for ambient shooting. Once I add a flash, I change things up a little bit with how autofocus works, and I'll get to that later. Dive in here to the basic menus. So obviously image quality I've set to RAW. I do not do C-RAW just because the advantage of shooting the R6 is you already have small enough file sizes with the 20 megapixel sensor. There's no reason to try and save even more storage. If you're shooting the R5, I would recommend C-RAW. If you're shooting, high volume like a wedding day or something like that, C-RAW looks totally fine in my experience. And I don't shoot any JPEG at all. Okay. Cropping aspect ratio. I actually have one of my buttons customized to adjust this very, very quickly. But here in the menu, I'll obviously keep this set to full. This I keep zeroed out. ISO speed settings. This is pretty key. Not that I adjust ISO speed much, but if you go to the ISO speed range, make sure by default this is actually set to 100. But if you actually click this, you can go down to an artificially low ISO of 50, which inks out a little bit more dynamic range, even though it's technically like artificial. I like having that enabled, and then make sure your maximum is, the max, whatever max your camera can support. Okay, auto range, I keep that between 100 and 25,600, and I do use auto ISO a lot. This is coming from my Nikon days where auto ISO was beautifully implemented. I just got used to using it quite often. So I know a lot of Canon shooters don't care for it or just haven't really used auto ISO very much, I really recommend you play around with it a little bit more, and I'll show you how I have it set up. But when it's shooting and automatically adjusting my ISO, I don't want it going over 25,600. I want to be aware if I'm pushing past that and do it manually. So these are my maximum ranges for that. And then minimum shutter speed, I keep this at auto. Okay, HDR, that can be off. Auto lighting optimizer, that can be off. You want your behind the screen camera to be as flat and as true to how the raw file is going to look as possible. And if you start implementing auto lighting optimizer or any of these other like noise reduction and all that, you are getting a false impression of what the raw file is actually going to look like. And so you add a little bit of work later once you start to edit in Lightroom and stuff. So I keep all this kind of stuff off. Highlight tone priority, actually keep that off. Flicker reduction off. Speed light control, we'll get more to that in a second. White balance, I always shoot auto white balance. I see no reason to shoot in manual white balance at all, unless you can tell on the back of the screen that it's consistently in whatever space you're shooting missing white balance and everything just looks horrible all the time. Then maybe I would go to manual, but I almost always keep this on auto. And then custom white balance, I don't bother, but there is something really cool about white balance. Let me just see if I can pull this up in the back of the camera. Here it is in the key menu. When you go, when you're shooting, a lot of times what I'll do, I should probably make a dedicated post specifically for this feature, but a lot of times what I'll do is in your active shooting mode, you can hit the Q button and get shortcut access to a lot of your different settings. If you go to white balance here and hit info, you'll see this grid line that gives you the ability to adjust cooler, warmer, more magenta, more green. And what's cool about this is it actually is a relative offset. So essentially what it'll do is whatever it thinks the white balance should be at automatically, it plus or minuses, it offsets that amount. And it actually writes that to the raw file. So if you constantly find yourself having to adjust your images cooler or adjust your images warmer in post about an equal amount, you can actually set this offset to accommodate it for that a little bit. So me personally, my preset in Signal Flow warms everything up just a little bit. So I tend to shoot with my white balance offset a little bit cooler in camera, and that carries over to the raw file as well. So it's a really handy little tool, this like white balance info offset graph. Just something like that is enough that it gets it much, much closer in camera for me when combined with my preset. So again, you get to that by when you're in your shooting screen, hit the Q button, then go to the white balance section over here on your right side and hit the info button. And you can, using the little joystick on the back of your camera, move that to anywhere you want for sort of an offset white balance. Sorry, it's also here in white balance shift/bracket. You can do it outside of the menu as well, or you can do it inside of the menu as well. Color space, I always keep it at sRGB. If you are really weird or particular about these things, adobeRGB is technically like a little bit higher quality in some ways. You can think of it as sort of in terms of like losing data. It goes raw file, adobeRGB, sRGB, and so you can convert backwards, but you're not going to get the same amount of color if you've already shot in sRGB, but you also introduce a lot of potential printing issues, a lot of cross-translation and converting issues from one screen to the next if you shoot adobeRGB. I shoot sRGB. Simple as that. Picture style standard, clarity 0, lens aberration correction, whatever is default. I don't mess with that at all. No noise reduction, no high-speed ISO, dust delete data, don't worry about that. If you're shooting in RAW, again, none of these really matter. Multiple exposure, that's disabled by default. HDR mode off, focus bracketing off. Internal timer disabled, blah, blah, blah. Let's see, shutter mode. I always do, almost always, electric first curtain. But if you do want to shoot in complete and utter silence, you want to switch to electronic. And I actually have a shortcut for that. I'll show you later at the end of this. But yeah, electronic is sort of if you just want it to be grabbing footage directly from the sensor with no curtain at all. But in general, I keep mine on electric first curtain. Release with shutter without card, turn that off so you don't accidentally take photos without your memory card in there. Image stabilization, I always do digital on, and then if you have a compatible lens, by default, I keep all this on as much as possible. Shutter touch, I keep that off. That just means if you have your EVF on the back here, the back of your little flip screen, wherever you touch, it will focus on and take the picture, which I don't really like as an experience. Image review, I turn that off so it doesn't show me the picture right after I just took it. And with the consistency between an EVF and a rear screen now, you see exactly what you're getting as you're getting it in terms of exposure and bokeh. So turn that off. Rear viewfinder, I also, disable. High-speed display, off. Metering timer, 8 seconds or whatever you need for the moment. Adjust that on the fly. Exposure simulation, absolutely make sure that's turned on. Now, this is an annoying thing about Canon cameras. It will, no matter what, show you the correct exposure in terms of brightness, but it doesn't accurately show you the bokeh unless you have a custom button mapped for that, or if you have this selected here. So I keep this on enabled, and then I have another button to show me my aperture accurately, what the bokeh is going to look like if I stop down or something. Shooting info display, let's see. I think most of these I kind of keep just on default because as I'm shooting, I usually have these off entirely. But yeah, I haven't adjusted any of those. VF vertical display on, grid display off, histogram shows brightness, focus distance. Okay, cool. VF display format, I keep it on display 2. So by default, it's display 1, which means it covers the edge to edge of your viewfinder. But I actually like having a slightly smaller thumbnail sort of view because I feel like I can assess the composition much more accurately. Again, you're not seeing as much of the space, but you get, I think, a better grasp because your eye doesn't have to move quite as much to get from, one end of the display to the other. So I keep that on display 2. Display performance, power saving is generally fine. With the R6, the battery life is so good, you could kind of go between these. I haven't had any issue with choppiness on the back of the screen, but if you are noticing any type of like stuttering or choppiness, it's hard to describe. But if it just doesn't look like super silky smooth on the back of your screen in a way that it bugs you, you can switch to smooth. You'll probably lose about 5% battery, maybe 10 at the most. Power saving is fine. Movie quality, I'm not going to get into movie stuff since I'm assuming everybody listening to this is primarily a still photographer. Okay, AF operation. This is where it gets a little more interesting. AF operation, servo AF. Keep that on by default. AF method, I actually turned off all the things you see grayed out because I literally never use them. I don't even want them as an option. The vast majority of the time I stick in L plus tracking, the like 3D tracking mode. Subject to detect people, but there is an animals option here if you want to dive in and if you specialize or you're going to be photographing in animals. But I keep that on people. Eye detection enabled, continuous AF disabled. All this does is keep the focus tracking. So you can see I have it turned on right now, and wherever my focus point is floating on top of, it will automatically, without me engaging any autofocus, try and track on top of that. I actually do have that turned on when I use a flash, but I have it off whenever I'm actually shooting. So movie servo, that's fine, that's enabled, but we're not going to get into movie stuff. Touch and drag. So this is a pretty cool feature that I never use, but it essentially, if it's turned on, what this allows you to do is use your rear display here as a virtual focus point mover. So you can be shooting through the EVF, and you'll notice whenever your camera's up against your eye, this screen turns off, right? But if you have touch and drag turned on, you can hold this up to your head and use your thumb on this screen to virtually move your focus point around. So again, I don't do that because I move my focus point by starting on what I want in focus and then having it follow them while I have autofocus engaged. But if you're the type of photographer that likes to move your focus point around to where you want it to be, I would actually recommend touch to drag for sure. Turn that on because you get to just drag your entire thumb around on the screen and it moves your focus point around exactly like you're seeing here instead of having to use the joystick. But, it's not something I regularly use. I have it enabled, but I almost never use it. All right, Manual focus peaking, turn that on. So if you do want to jump into manual focus real quick, you get like a nice little highlight red on your, I don't know if it's going to show on the screen since I'm going HDMI out, but if focus peaking's on and you're in a normal situation, it will just kind of mask everything in a light red or whatever color highlight you prefer to show you what is likely in focus and sharp and what's not. Focus guide, turn that off. AF assist beam firing, that's fine if it's on, but generally it's not going to trigger anyway. That just lights this little light on if you're in super low light. But I shoot with a flash, and there's other things that happen to help with that. So the actual like tracking speed and the sensitivity to how quickly the autofocus tries to react and move around to things, I find auto works beautifully. Okay, lens electronic manual focus. So I actually have this to be one-shot enabled. One-shot enabled, I honestly can't remember why I always have that on. There's something about the manual focus experience that I know that I always keep it on this, but I can't quite remember. In the info, it says after autofocusing, this enables you to focus manually by keeping the shutter button half pressed. But I'm not sure exactly what that means because I can autofocus right now and I'm trying to manual focus and it's not letting me jump into that. So I can't remember exactly why that's on, but that's what I always have it set at and I never change it. One-shot AF release priority. So I did change this to be release, not focus priority, because I would prefer it just take the picture and assume that it's probably in focus, not wait until it thinks it knows it's in focus. Because sometimes I can see, and I know with my own two eyes, it's focused on what I want, and I just want it to take the picture as soon as I release the shutter no matter what, whether it's definitely in focus, whether the camera thinks it's definitely in focus or not. So I keep that on release. Switch track subjects, I keep this on 1. Lens drive when AF impossible, I keep this on, continuous focus search. AF limit method, so this is where you can turn off all the AF modes you probably don't use. I have all of these check marked off, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, and I keep spot and I keep L tracking. Those are the only 2 I keep turned on. AF method selection control. So I have this set to the manual, the selection control to manual function, but the way that I shoot, this actually doesn't really do anything. So you can kind of just set it like that and not worry about it if you prefer. And then orientation linked AF points. So that's kind of cool. I keep this separate AF points. So essentially what it does is if you've got in the upper third kind of the shot arranged, when you switch, it's probably not going to, when you switch to a vertical orientation, the focus point jumps to a separately stored memory. So if you can see, the focus point is moving on its own from me rotating vertically versus horizontally. It just jumps relative to that. And I really like that because I can kind of keep it, for vertical, I kind of keep my focus point right around here. So if somebody's walking down the aisle, I can quickly snap that. And then if they get really close to me and I want to go wide, I can rotate without having to move my focus point in any way. It jumps back to that upper third area. I really, really love that feature and have that enabled all the time. Okay, now here's some very, very important settings. Initial servo AF point for L. So I have the point set, the middle option. This is what I'm pretty sure keeps it jumping back after moving it for wherever you recompose to. As soon as I let the shutter back up, it always goes back to that initial starting point. That is set here, and you can hit the info button to read about it. But yeah, servo AF continues from the AF point set for spot AF, single point AF, or expanded when switching between things. So yeah, I always keep this in the middle. Focus ring rotation, whatever you prefer. I like the reverse direction because I came from shooting Nikon. So I keep that on. RF lens manual focus ring sensitivity. I keep that varies with rotation speed because I figure if I'm moving it faster, I want it to be a little bit more sensitive. So it's like a relative versus an absolute type of setting. Keep that on. Sensitivity AF, that's on 0. I don't think I change much in the playback. Let me just double check. No. Nothing. Here, I do a 2 times magnification for when I zoom in to check stuff. We'll get more to that in a second. But yeah, 2x for magnification. And then image jump. This is really, really nice. I have this set to 15. So if you are in playback mode and you're reviewing images, you can have it skip in chunks of 15 instead of 1 at a time or 10 at a time. So I have, when we get to my button control in a second, you'll see I have my index finger on the wheel on top to jump by 15, and then I have my thumb for the wheel on the bottom to jump 1 image at a time. So that's nice to have the option to go in huge bursts and then 1 image at a time very, very easily. Okay, switch, I have that disabled. Rate button function, I have that set to stars. Playback information display, I have that set to the default. None of these have been changed. Highlight alert disable, AF point disable, blah, 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 blah. Just make that the same. I'm not going to get into any Wi-Fi stuff because it's still kind of annoying. Okay, here's really important. They don't make it very intuitive, but if you want to write to 2 cards, you go down here to record options, the second one here, record to multiple. You don't want to record separately or auto switch card or standard. I don't even know what standard is. I just do record to multiple. So the exact same still images get written to both memory cards as a duplicate of one another. But here is important. Where you play back and look at things, especially if you do in-camera double exposures, you want to make sure it's referencing the card that you know it's looking at. So I always have it set to card number 1, which I believe is the slot closest to me. Yeah, slot number 1 is the one that's closest to you in your camera body. So, where were we? Yeah, so that's what I like to have is like kind of my master memory card. Card number 2 might as well never leave my camera body. I might as well be like super glued in there because all I do is keep it in there. When I'm done shooting at a wedding, I take slot 1 out, put it in my pocket or in my camera case so that they're in 2 separate locations, and then I import them back up from that camera. Record play, and then the folders, those are all default. File numbering, I set to continuous. File name, that's by default. Format card, auto rotate, definitely make sure that's on so that your raw files come in automatically rotated for vertical versus portrait orientation. Add that, for video rotation, I also have that enabled, and then your date and time. This is all normal, default stuff. Power saving, I have display off after 30 minutes and then all these other things set to never. Again, the battery life is so good on the R6, I never have this stuff really power off. But again, with the R5, I would probably set this to like 5, maybe 10 minutes so that you don't burn through battery. I always had that issue. Again, maybe they fixed the R5 through some firmware updates, but I've moved on in my life. Eco mode, turn that off. I have the auto switching set as my setting. I don't know if that's by the default or not, but that way, if your eye is up here, it goes EVF, and if it's down here, it goes viewfinder. I think that should have been how it comes out of the box. I don't know why it's not set, but so that's set to auto 2. Screen brightness 4, that's all default. UI magnification disable, although it's kind of a cool feature. HDMI resolution, auto, multifunction lock. This is key. So I have a button set. This actually, I don't think you can make it do anything else. The lock button here, I have it set to lock one thing and one thing only, and that's the touch screen. Because I've got the touch to drag feature turned on, I make sure that it's not doing it because I'm recording to this HDMI recorder, but if you go up to your EVF and you don't have your touch screen locked, it will, your nose or something else accidentally touching the screen will move your focus point constantly. So I find that very annoying, and that's what I have this one button mapped to. But you can, this lock button can be mapped to lock all these other settings if you want, but that's the touch screen is the only one that I've consistently had an annoyance with. Shutter at shutdown, I say closed. That way, when you take your lens off or do any swapping and your camera's off, the sensor is shielded and you're not likely to get as much dust. All right. Custom shooting mode. So if you're not aware, your C1, 2, and 3 options here are really, really great. Like my default, what I'm showing you right now, settings, I have mapped to custom 1. And to register those settings, you do it here in the menu under custom shooting mode. So if you're in manual mode or whatever you like to shoot in, and you've got everything dialed in just perfectly and you always want to be able to get back to those settings, set it in manual mode, go here to custom shooting mode, and then you say register settings, and then save it in whatever custom settings mode you want. So I would save it all in C1, and it's going to overwrite whatever exists there currently. If you've never used it, it'll just add it, and you're good to go. It will always, I set auto update to disable. It's hard to explain this without like a diagram sometimes, but if you have auto update on and you're in custom 1 mode, it will remember whatever changes you've made. It'll permanently write those. So I don't want that. I always want it to be saved and then disable. And so if I ever click out of custom 1 or any of the other custom settings and I go back into it, it is reset to where I originally registered the settings. Hopefully that made sense. Battery info, that's good to know. I'm using a very old battery in this camera at this very moment. Copyright info, I don't mess with any of that stuff. Okay, this is default, exposure increments, ISO increments, default. Here, speed after, so I have this set to auto off, so what is that? I can't quite recall. Retain speed after metering, so keep the adjusted ISO speed value even after metering ends. I can't remember why, but that is an important feature that I always have on. Bracketing, auto cancel on. I never shoot with bracketing, so I don't really play with that. Same exposure for new aperture. So this is kind of cool. If you jump between a 1.8 or a 1.4 or a 2.8 lens, where the max aperture is different, it will auto boost whatever ISO you were previously on to match that exposure. So if you go from a 2.8 lens to a 1.2 or something like that, it will knock the ISO down to match the relative exposure based on what aperture you had set, which I think is kind of cool. So I always have that turned on. I always keep the sender weighted spot evaluative metering. Set shutter speed range. I have this, the max ranges. Set aperture range. Make sure this is set to whatever you want. If you have a 1.2 lens, like the 50 1.2, you want to make sure the aperture is open to 1.0, not 1.4, or literally just won't let you get to it. So make sure that's as wide open as you're preferring. Dial direction, normal. Control ring rotation, normal. Here we get into some of the more fun stuff. So I have my shutter button set to meter and engage autofocus. You don't have to shoot the way that I shoot, especially as it regards this. A lot of people prefer the autofocus button on the back to engage their autofocus. I prefer having the shutter be half pressed. It's just the way I've always done it, and I really like that. So I always have the shutter button half pressed. That engages my autofocus, and at the same time, it starts tracking metering. That's what this setting does. Okay, so the movie record button, this is what, if you jump down here to the setting that I have, gives me the depth of field preview. If I shoot at something other than f1.8, you can see I'm set at f8 right now, but it's still showing me, the proper exposure for this frame, the brightness, but not the aperture. So if now I hold that button, it shows me the f8 bokeh render, the field of view, the depth of field at that setting, at f8. So I get a sense of exactly what's going on, and I can take the picture, and it'll look exactly how I intend it. So that's mapped to my record button. My AF on button is set to lock metering and stop autofocus. So essentially, once I hold this button on the back of the screen, it locks everything, and I'm committed to where my focus point is and what my metering is set to. That's just how I do it. But if you're a more normal photographer, you'll probably have this button set to metering and AF start. Again, I just map that to my shutter button because I prefer it. This setting here is key for a lot of things. So I have this star button, it's the AE lock button. I have that mapped, this really special feature that I love in Canon cameras, and it's register/recall shooting function. If we go to it and you just select it, it doesn't seem like it does anything, but if you go back into it and hit the info button for detailed settings, you can pre-register an entirely new collection of settings on your camera and enable those with a button press. So I have this button set to enable auto ISO only. You can see the check mark is only here under ISO speed, and that's preset to auto. And so that's incredible. You can literally, without having to fidget with any custom functions up here, just by the press of a button, jump in and out of two entirely different sets of focus, of camera settings that cover not just ISO, that's all I use it for, but you can have it go to a preset shutter speed or a preset aperture. It's absolutely crazy to think about the possibilities that can be enabled here. But I love that you can just jump right in and out of an entirely separate set of settings. Again, I have mine set to auto ISO, so I can be shooting at any setting, and as soon as I hit this button, you can see my auto ISO gets enabled, and metering and exposure and everything tracks relative to ISO now. So if I'm in a really tricky shooting location, like where it's really bright, maybe in one side of the room and really dark on the other side of the room, I'll shoot in auto ISO constantly, so that I'm not always having to adjust up or down my exposure settings. It's really, really a nice way to shoot, and it's something that I loved in my Nikon days. Okay, I have the little grid AF point button actually set to toggle my rear screen versus my EVF, just because sometimes it's sort of tricky and it doesn't always get it right automatically. And then, this front button here, I have this set to do one of my absolute favorite features that I use all the time. Because I shoot prime lenses, I don't often get the reach that, or the perspective and the aspect ratio that I want. So I have this button set to enable that cropping that we talked about earlier. So immediately I can crop into 4:3 and get that extra sort of cropped reach in camera and make my compositions and all my framing and decision making relative to that aspect ratio, which I really, really like. Here we are. So it's the 1.6 crop that I regularly go to. And yeah, this does make whatever image I capture only 7.7 megapixels. So that's pretty small, but that's still way big enough for the vast majority of what clients might print like. And it's just really nice to be able to jump in and out of getting that extra reach. And again, I have that set to this button here, this front button. Lens autofocus, I don't have any buttons on my lenses, so that I just haven't really addressed. My manual function button here on top, I have set to zoom in and magnify. Now, there's a problem with that. When you're in tracking mode, it doesn't let you magnify, which is very annoying. But that's one reason I have the autofocus button on the back set up to lock, because it essentially jumps me into manual focus instantly. So with this set to magnify, I can hold the AF button on the back, then jump into zoom and get, really, really sharp manual focus if I'm in a really tricky situation, jump back out, recompose, and shoot. So it's just a weird, bizarre way to do it. But again, when I have my thumb on the back, it disengages autofocus, which means I'm now in manual focus. I can tap the manual focus button and get instant zoom. And then I can recompose and I'm done. So that is why I really like having the manual function button set to magnify/reduce. And then the set button in the very middle of the control ring, I have that set to boost my monitor brightness. If I'm in really bright sunlight, sometimes it's hard to actually see the back of the screen just physically, so you can artificially boost everything about the back of it, and it will brighten up for as long as you have that pressed, which is really nice. And then this multifunction joystick or whatever, I just have that set to move my focus point, even though I almost never use it for that. Whew. Okay, customized dials. So I have my top thumb set to aperture adjustment, my rear top wheel set to shutter adjustment, and then my actual wheel on the back set to ISO, and then my control wheel also set to ISO, which I really, really like. Okay, add cropping information, no. Audio compression, it doesn't really matter. Release shutter without lens, turn this on if you want to do any type of freelensing. So that just means when the lens is detached, it'll still let you take pictures. I keep that on. Okay, retract lens on power off. That just means if you happen to have a lens that the front element kind of sticks out or in, it will always retract before powering off, which I like. And that's it. In my shortcuts, I have quick access to image stabilization mode being turned on and off, multiple exposures, right here, format card, battery info, shutter mode, so I can quickly jump to electronic versus first curtain, date and time, and then to configure your menus, that's always the last option here. Here, I'll just set a second menu up. I highly recommend you do this. Jump to the very last thing, the star here, the green menu. Go to, if you haven't set anything up, you'll be in the first tab, but I'm going to go ahead and you can only put so many on a screen. I'm going to jump to tab 2, add a second tab. Then you want to say configure. So now you can select the items you want to add to your overall list here. So you have literally every single menu option that we just went through right here. You can add them in any order. Say you want to have quick access to playback grid. Sure, add it. Let me back out. There's playback grid. And then you go back down here to configure to add even more. Or sort what you've already added, or delete things that you realize, I don't really want it there. So I'm going to add, I want quick access to ISO speed settings. Cool. So there it is in my menu. But say I want that to actually be at the top. I'm going to sort my registered items. I'm going to move that up. Boop. Done. So you can really go crazy customizing all these different menus. This is just what I've got in mind. I want quick access to format my cards, check my battery info, especially with the R6 not having the battery screen on the top here. I always like having quick access to detailed battery info right here in my menu. And then that's really it as far as ambient light shooting. I'm going to make a completely separate video for settings when I shoot with flash, because I think this is already too long of a video. I don't want to add even more to it. But yeah, my Q button here shows you sort of the overall baseline settings. I always shoot AF with L tracking, servo, RAW set to record to both memory cards. Drive mode, I typically shoot in high continuous. Not high continuous plus, just high continuous. Metering mode, I use the center weighted. Flicker off, I already showed you the white balance thing. And then the picture style that I see in camera, I have set to standard, auto light the stuff off, and then full, although I regularly switch between full and 1.6 to get that extra reach. Cool, so I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know any questions at all. And again, we'll follow up with a second video when shooting with a flash. It's not that different, but it's different enough. I think it warrants its own separate post. So thank you so much. I hope you made it through this far, and have a good day.